Daydreaming about dragons. Let's talk for a moment about patterns and repetition. These are really important things in gaming, and they've been coming up a lot because they always come up a lot, and they're useful. They're useful because humans see patterns and repetition. We see it in everything, right? When you go back to a city that you haven't been to in a long time, you remember the state you were in the last time you were in that city, right? If you haven't been in that city since you've been married, you're going to remember, wow, last time I was in this city, it was to go on a date because I was single, right? If you haven't been in a place and the last time you were there, you were in this miserable state because you were mourning someone, you're going to remember that vividly. And you can use that in gaming. It's useful. So I like to use D&D as an example because it's kind of ubiquitous. So I'll use D&D as an example. Players come back to town, second or third time they've done it. Mention how that time is different than the other times, right? This time you're coming back victorious. Last time you had 3 dead hirelings and your cleric was bleeding to death. You know, this time feels different, but the ghosts of those hirelings are near, right? You can feel them. And you can draw on things that have happened before and compare them to one another. These things happen a lot for me lately in Blades in the Dark, because it's a setting that it kind of plays with that repetition, right? I had a situation where in the first case that the players were on, the conclusion of the case, the big kind of end scene, was in Rowan Tower, which is this tower that one of the founding families built. I called it like a Victorian fortress skyscraper, right? And then they had another big scene a couple of weeks ago in the Crow's Tower. And I read the description of it because I wanted it to be different than Rowan Tower, right? I described Rowan Tower and I really went all out describing the view and how opulent it was and how well fortified it was. And when I read about the Crow's Tower, it wasn't quite as high. And it was an old tower that like a medieval astronomer had used. So I described it as old-fashioned, and I described the glass dome, the kind of dirty glass dome over the main room that an astronomer had used, as a viewing room to look at the stars. And you can find those little details and make one different than the other. I didn't do it quite as well when I had this situation where one character went to Skurlock Manor, which is basically like, if you had a Victorian crime city and Dracula was in it, that's Skurlock, right? He's kind of this badass one-man faction Dracula, awesome guy. And then I had another character in the other big haunted house in the setting, which is the Dimmer Sisters headquarters. And suddenly I had to make these very different from one another. I had to find those little details, how one was different than the other. In some ways I did it, in some ways I didn't. But look for those moments. It happened in my Burning Wheel game, and in which there was this interesting path that the players took on the first couple of games, down through the map, through the stolen lands. And when we got a new character, because the character died, he got to take that same route. And it was really interesting because we got to do the same thing, but show how different the world was since the players had arrived, right? We had this real Deadwood moment where a new character got to see how built up everything was. And this hill, this barren hill where the players had like set up camp during the first camp, arc, suddenly had like a little shanty town on it. And people were digging ditches to build walls. It makes it very different, but it shows, you can show patterns. You can show, hey, there's similarities here too. So you can show things growing, show how things are changing. More importantly, show two things. two important things. Show how the world is in motion beyond the characters, and show how the characters' actions have had an effect. Show how the things they've thrown in the pond, things they've thrown in the pond, the stones they've thrown in the pond have elicited ripples. But look for those moments of repetition, and tease out the differences. Hey, last time you folks did this, last time you were in the capital city, you were slack-jawed nobodies, and now you're walking in as total badasses. That feels different. The guards look at you in a different way now. Before, they were just kind of tired and like, oh, come on, pay your copper, get in. But the last time you folks came here, it cost everything you have to even get a pass to get into the city. Now you pay it like it's nothing. Now you come in the special entrance. Show the differences. Show how things are different. The other day, we had a murder case in the Blaze in the Dark game, and it was the first time they had a murder, a dead person show up in a really rich part of town. Not like an okay affluent part of town, like super rich. And I showed that because the people who were cordoning off the area were getting, talked at by rich people, very privileged rich people who were like, hey, what's going on? Hey, I know your boss. Tell me what's going on now. This is my neighborhood. Whereas in neighborhoods with the poor folk, it's very different. They don't have that kind of relationship with the law enforcement. They keep their heads down and they walk away, right? They do not go up and talk to them because they don't want to be a suspect. Whereas the rich folk never imagined that they would be a suspect. Show the differences. Look for similarities and tease them out. And that's a good way to make the world real without having to make up tons of new stuff. All you have to do is look at the similarities. How is this similar to that? Players go to one city after going to another. Describe how this city is different. Hey, the capital really smelled, but this city is actually better put together, right? They've got their city workers and they've got things set up so that the garbage gets taken out. It's actually well run. Tease out the differences. Find the similarities and tease out the differences. And that's a really good way to world build. That way, it's not just, yep, you're in a city again. They're all the same. And maybe that's what you want to say. Maybe it's just not important, right? If you're playing with characters who are on a huge level, maybe it just isn't important. But maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe you want to tease out the differences. One of your characters, you're playing a superhero game, someone's Superman, they're flying over a city. Talk about how Chicago looks a lot different than LA. How there's just not nearly the sprawl in Chicago that Los Angeles has. Los Angeles seems to go on forever. Chicago feels finite in comparison. You can see the areas where you want to push a big fight, Superman. But with LA, it's like it feels impossible. It feels like there's nowhere far enough to push out unless you get out over the ocean. Find these similarities and differences. Find the patterns that are happening in your game and play with them. They're really useful tools. And you can see it in all kinds of literature. You can see it in all kinds of TV shows. And you can see it in your own life. Think about what you were thinking. Think about times you go back to a place and it evokes a memory, right? Weird story, kind of almost a personal story, but I went back to an apartment years ago that I had lived in years previous because I left something in the basement and I was curious if it was still there. So I went into the apartment. It was open. I knew everything was going to be open. Not the apartment, it was all the common areas, right? The basement was like an open common area. So I went into the basement and my stuff was still there. So I just went in and took it out. Okay, that's not the point of this story. The point of this story is the smell of the apartment was so intense. Like, it didn't smell bad, but it evoked such a memory that I literally had an emotional reaction. I remembered how I felt living in that apartment. It was not a happy time for me. I was dealing with a lot of health issues. I hadn't been diagnosed with celiac disease yet. It was a very difficult couple of years. And when I went back, I had this vivid flashback. Oh my goodness. You can play with that. You can play with that in your games. When people go back places, when there's repetition, when there are patterns, you can show how far the characters have come. You can show how the characters have changed. You can show how the world has changed towards them. If you've got any example of this, I'd love to see it. I'd love to hear about it. I'd love to listen to it. Let me know. All right, let's get to the inspiration goat. One more thing before we get to the inspiration goat. So something else you can do with patterns and repetition, because a type of pattern is an expectation, right? So if you are in a scene that is iconic, right? If you are in a scene where an apprentice is casting their first spell, a squire is being taught how to use a sword for the first time, a pair of investigators are interviewing someone they know is guilty. These are scenes that we see in fiction all the time, and you can use that as an opportunity to play with that. You can leave your mark on it. You can talk to the player about what they like about those types of scenes and what they don't. You can do it, but with a twist. Change it up a little bit. Make it yours, make it firmly in your world, right? So think about that. Think about how something might be different because it's in your world, and it might not be what you see on TV or in the movies or read in books. You can play with those. That's a part of the pattern recognition. That might be its own thing. It might be its own segment. So maybe we'll tease that out later. But for now, 1.5 minutes on it. There we go. Good one. All right, so back in episode 14, I talked about a cartoon on Netflix called The Dragon Prince, and I want to go back to it months later because I watched it again. I listened to what I said about it last time, and I want to talk about other things. So last time I talked about children NPCs and children player characters. So children player characters as a way of having your players not know very much about the world and then have to learn it as children, which I think is interesting. And an interesting way for a reason for them to be pretty ignorant and not know much about the world around them. And then NPCs as a way of saying what you want about the world right away, right? Because children react differently. Children don't try to hide things quite as much as the adult characters do. Okay, what do I want to talk about? But we've got a new angle, right? Otherwise, the inspiration goat wouldn't have brought it back. The new angle is I want to talk about history. Because I feel like what Dragon Prince is doing in really interesting ways is showing how history is written by the victors. And I think that's a really valuable, interesting thing to have in your game, right? Especially if you've got a game that might have some kind of history role and you want to know, hey, does my character know anything deeper, right? So rather than say no when they fail the role, let's talk about a failed history role. Rather than say, no, you don't know anything about that, and rather than tell them something wrong, here's a new way to tell them something wrong. Tell them what the powers that be want them to know about history if they fail. You don't know anything deeper than that, right? Columbus discovered America. That's what you know, right? If you fail the role, that's all you know. There was this new country, this new land, Columbus discovered it. That is straight up a failed history role. If you succeed in the role, then you learn a more nuanced version of history, probably a more useful version of history, a version of history that doesn't play into ideas that are designed to make you comfortable. So let's think about that in our history, and think about it in your world building too. When you build a world, think about, okay, well, this is what happened. What do people actually say about it though? right? What do people learn about this? What are they taught? What are the myths? And I don't mean myth like how is this, how is the sun created? Is it killed every day and then resurrected by the next morning? I mean like myths like Christopher Columbus discovered America. What are the things that we're told that are simple and simplistic and not necessarily true, but very useful to those in power? And I think the Dragon Prince does that in a really cool way. The intro to the first episode, I'm pretty sure, is narrated by a straight up villain. And that's interesting. And especially if you've got a world where the bad guys have really won, right? If you've got one of those, hey, the Lich King is in charge type worlds, what has the Lich King said about history? Right? Because I doubt it's that undead are abominations and need to be rooted out. Right? It's probably that those who go beyond life are only the true worthy. And those who are living are eking out, their pathetic existence because they're unworthy. They haven't been chosen, by the skull. People who shed the illusion of muscle and bone and skin and just show their muscle and skin and show their true bones. These are true people. Then you're set like a hierarchy among the undead, right? Suddenly death knights and liches are over vampires. That's getting interesting. So think about what myths folks would tell. And who does it benefit? How does this history keep someone in power and keep someone comfortable? How does it make someone else uncomfortable and make someone else feel unworthy and keep them in their place? Think about your world building. Think about your history in those terms sometimes a little bit. I think it'll be valuable for you. Okay? I've got a friend who's designing a game very much about that. My friend Rob is designing a game called Demi-Humans. I'll put a link to it. It is definitely... my pitch is different maybe than his pitch, but I think we agree. My pitch is like it's after Lord of the Rings. Sauron is dead, and the only evil left is the terrible evils of racism, capitalism, and patriarchy, right? This is what is left in the world. And it's still pretty evil, but here we go. And it's a cool game. And I think it plays into this idea of history very much and how it affects the community. So I'll put a link to it in the show notes. I hope you liked it. I'm going to go short with an inspiration code today because I went kind of long with the actual play. And I will see you in a bit. So let's do the outro, and then we'll see you next time. Hold on. Here's the outro. Hold on. And outro. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to support the show, you can hit the support the show button, give money every month. You can purchase Dictionary of Moo, which is a book I wrote. Check it out. I think you'll like it. Or you can send me an email, a tweet, an MP3. You can do it via Anchor, however you want to do it. And let me know if any of the things I talked about today spoke to what's going on with you at your table. If you are on your way home from Big Bad Con, I hope you had a splendid time and that your journey is safe and that you have found that you're very stimulated and ready to make cool stuff and get it out there. All right. Hope your autumn is going well. Hope it's full of Snapdragon apples, the finest apples in the world. Calling it. Have a good one. I'll see you next week.